Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Scott, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to comment on the JJC Bradfield Lecture that we've just heard from Scott Farquhar. And at the outset, I want to congratulate him for an insightful and exceptionally well-informed lecture. He really is in an extraordinary position to speak about the software revolution and Australia's place in it, and I think that showed. In my comments, I want to briefly highlight 4 points which struck me from what Scott has put before us this evening. First, something which Scott, for obvious reasons, could not say. In my view, Scott Farquhar and his co-founder Mike Cannon-Brookes, who I'm so pleased is with us this evening, are Australian heroes. Look, Scott gave us the facts. They started the business in 2001 straight out of university. Today it employs over 1,000 people around the world, over half of them in Sydney. They've brought in over $800 million in export revenue since the company got started. Let me give you the colour on that. This is an extraordinary achievement. They've built a scale, global business in a ruthlessly competitive sector. As Australians, we should be very, very proud of what they have done. Now, Scott rightly observed that as a country we tend to brag about our sporting achievements, but play down our business ones. But theirs is a story, in my view, that needs to be widely told, widely known, and going well beyond the business pages. Many Australians would know how Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook in his dorm room, how Google founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin met doing computer science at Stanford. The story of Scott Farquhar and Mike Cannon-Brookes should be just as well known. And one reason it needs to be well known is to inspire and encourage other Australians who might be considering starting a tech sector business, because the more who take the plunge, the better our prospects of building that self-sustaining flywheel that Scott talked about. My second observation is that Scott's given us a really sharp reminder of the importance of individuals, of entrepreneurs, of risk takers, of the private sector, as the mechanism by which prosperity is generated out of technological innovation. He told us about his first employee, their first employee, who slept on his couch for a month. And in an early conversation with Scott as we were discussing this lecture, he told me about going to their first trade show in San Francisco in 2003. 3 of them, I think he said, shared a hotel room at $80 a night. Now, this is a really critical point about success in the tech sector, the importance of individual effort. It's not something that government can replicate. And if you'll forgive me for being political for a second, that is something I'd suggest which the previous government seemed to wish were different. Its default approach was that if a sector was vital to the economy, then we needed to pump billions of dollars, of taxpayers' dollars, into establishing a state-owned enterprise to dominate the sector. Hence the establishment of the $43 billion National Broadband Network Company and the $10 billion Clean Energy Finance Corporation. I've not checked the records, but I rather doubt there are any recorded instances of 3 NBN co-executives bunking down together in an $80 a night hotel room. I don't say that to be critical of the fine individuals at NBN Co, many of whom are here tonight. But the story of the tech sector globally is that start-up businesses which succeed can create a lot of wealth and a lot of jobs in a remarkably short time. And as Scott's lecture reminds us, Atlassian, as well as some other Australian companies, have demonstrated this principle. And I was particularly struck by his observation that at least 10 Australian tech companies worth more than $100 million have the bulk of their sales overseas. A paper issued by Google earlier this year noted that 9 of the top 10 people on the 2013 BRW Young Rich list made their fortune in the tech sector. Well, that's obviously great news for the founders of startups who hit the big time. But it's also important, and this is why policymakers should be so concerned, it's also important for the broader economy because of the outsized role of startups in job creation and in turn the disproportionate role of the high-tech sector in generating startup companies. A recent report from America's Kaufman Foundation found that new business formation was 23% more likely in the high-tech sector of the US economy than in the private sector as a whole. And moreover, in information and communications technology, that's to say a subsector of the broader high-tech sector, it was 48% more likely. The importance of startups was also noted by the OECD in its most recent Science, Technology and Innovation report. 1/3 of job creation in the business sector comes from young firms with fewer than 50 employees, even though these make up only 11% of total employment. The third thing that I found noteworthy in the lecture was the insights into Atlassian's strategy of serving businesses rather than consumers. Scott pointed out that Australians can compete on the world stage in software, but you need to be very good because every other country can do the same. Well, one key issue that's often remarked upon in Australia is our small domestic market. This is a significant challenge when it comes to building market scale in consumer applications. It's surely no coincidence that the largest consumer-facing software and software-based businesses, such as Google, Facebook and Apple, come from the US, a country with one of the largest consumer marketplaces in the world, and it's surely also not a coincidence that the challenges to those in terms of scale are emerging from China, a country which also has an enormous domestic marketplace. But perhaps one observation about the Atlassian story is that in business-to-business software, this is not such a big issue, and that might be consistent with perhaps the experience of the German-based SAP over the past 30 years. The final point which stood out for me in what Scott had to say was the importance of public policy settings in a number of areas to underpin our prospects of being a nation with a strong software industry. He had some very important points about employee share ownership schemes and venture capital, but the point I want to focus on is the need for the right skills in the workforce. Clearly, when it comes to having enough skilled people to support the software industry, two critical policy levers sit squarely with government: education and immigration. As Chief Scientist Ian Chubb noted in a report issued last month, quotes, "The global economy is changing. New technologies and smart companies lead. Nations at all levels of development are now focusing on the skills required for building new jobs and creating wealth. At the core of almost every agenda is a focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths." Well, this is important both at the university level, where the Abbott government has a major focus on freeing up universities to be more flexible and responsive to market demand, but also at the school level, as is demonstrated by some of the examples which Scott gave about what other countries are doing. Clearly, this is a timely point to be raising when the review of the Australian curriculum was released yesterday, and Education Minister Christopher Pyne has stated that there will now be discussions with states and territories and other key stakeholders about how to strengthen and refine the curriculum. Immigration policy settings also emerged strongly in the lecture as a limiting factor on getting the right skills. Certainly the Abbott government is setting immigration policy with an eye towards meeting the skill needs of the economy. For example, in this year's immigration program, nearly 68% of Australia's migration places are allocated to skilled migration, and there is a reprioritisation towards employer-sponsored visas. Well, to conclude these observations, tonight Scott Farquhar has given a detailed and well-researched lecture explaining the software revolution and what it means for Australia, and setting out some things that in his view need to happen if Australia is to best capture the opportunities that this revolution presents. Scott's put a lot of time and effort into this lecture, no doubt because he sees it as part of his role, his wider role as a leader within this sector. And both Scott and Mike have demonstrated an enormous commitment to leadership in their work over the life of Atlassian as a company. Scott's given his frank point of view, not cleared by me in advance, I hasten to add, and that's exactly what I wanted him to do. In my view, he's got some serious and important things to say, and I'm very grateful that such a busy tech sector business leader has taken the time to give his frank and unvarnished views. It is critical to sensible policy development in this area that government is in no doubt what the sector is saying. Scott, thanks for leaving us in no doubt.